All right, what's going on, everyone? So you've had 15 or so minutes to work on this activity in your groups. Normally, I would be in person with you and we'd be doing the debrief. We're just going to do it video style today. All right. So we're trying to figure out what's wrong with these surveys. I think there's three scenarios. And so I've got some like sample student responses. We'll read through them and then I'll give you some notes to put in the margin. So remember, for the margin notes, you want to be using a red pen. Okay. So identify what's wrong with each of these surveys. Be sure to explain. Number one, the mayor of Springfield is interested in finding out the average age of people in the city. He obtains a list of all the landline telephones in the city, and then he contacts a simple random sample of 300 people. Okay. He uses the data from the sample to estimate the average age of all the people in the city. Okay. So what's wrong with the survey? All right. So a very common response to this is realizing that he's only contacting people with landlines. Okay. We know there are people that probably live in the city that don't have a landline. So he's really just kind of limiting his sampling frame to people with just landlines. Okay. So anybody who doesn't have a landline is completely excluded or not counted in this survey. Right, and then so do we think that the mayor is going to over or underestimate the true mean age of people in Springfield? Why? So this method is probably going to lead to an overestimate, right? When you think about people who own landlines, it's usually older people, like your grandparents' age probably. Um, Younger generations usually just rely on a cell phone and they don't tend to have landlines. So if we're only sampling people with landlines, we're most likely going to be sampling older folks. Okay, so here's the extra notes that I want you to add next to this problem. Okay, so when we're really limiting ourselves to the type of people we're sampling, okay, this is called, or the statistical word is called undercoverage. Okay, so this idea that he's only contacting people with landlines and he's omitting or excluding people without landlines is undercoverage. All right, great. Let's go ahead and move on to scenario number two. Right, the administration at a school wants to know the proportion of students that did all of their homework last night. They select a simple random sample of 100 students and send an email to each of them asking if they did all of their homework last night. Okay. Now they only get 40 responses, and 36 of the students who responded said that they did all their homework last night. So that's 90% who said they did. All right. So what's wrong with this survey? There's a couple things that's wrong, so that's why it's color-coded in blue and green, right? So one thing that students noticed that's wrong is that only 40 students responded, however, 100 were contacted. Okay? So there's 60 students, more than half of those who were selected who didn't even give a response. Okay? Another thing that students recognize that's wrong is that students might have lied on the survey, right? They might have said they did their homework when in reality they didn't. All right. So will the administration get an overestimate or an underestimate of the true proportion of students who did their homework? So we're most likely going to get an overestimate. Okay. Number one, students who did not do their homework are probably the ones who didn't reply in the first place, right? So those 60 students who didn't reply might have been ones who didn't do their homework. Also, the ones who did reply might feel pressured. Let me center this here. They might feel pressured to say yes that they did their homework, even though they didn't, right? So number one, people who didn't do their homework aren't responding, so we're not counting as many no's as we should. And people who did respond might be lying, so we're getting more yeses than we really should. All right. So these two different issues, we have a different statistical word for each, right? The fact that a large portion of the students who were contacted didn't respond is called non-response. Okay? And then the fact that students are lying, that they're not giving honest or accurate answers, that's called response bias. Okay, so for our third scenario, we're looking at Boy Scout Peter M., and he wants to know the proportion of people in his neighborhood who support the Boy Scouts. He takes a random sample of 30 homes and visits them dressed in his uniform. Okay. So there's some good qualities of what he's doing here. He's taking a random sample. Okay, so it's not a convenient sample. Okay, but what's wrong with what he's doing? Okay. Um, Now, a common response is to recognize that he's wearing his uniform when he goes to survey or interview these people, and the fact that he's in uniform could influence the way they respond. Okay? All right, so do we think Peter's going to get an overestimate or an underestimate of the true proportion of his neighbors who support the Boy Scouts? Well, just like the other scenarios, this is probably going to lead to an overestimate, right? When people see him in his uniform, right, they're most likely going to say that they support the Boy Scouts, even if they don't really, right? And the reason for that is they don't want to offend him. Remember, he's just a kid, right? So again, being dressed in his uniform is influencing how people are responding. In other words, they might not give honest answers. They might not give accurate answers, right? Because they don't want to offend him. So this is a similar situation that we saw in scenario 2, right? People were not giving honest answers because they, didn't want the administration to know they weren't doing homework. Here, people aren't giving honest answers because they don't want to offend the person who's surveying them. So this would be another example of response bias. All right. So in these three scenarios, we've looked at um, three different uh, things that can go wrong, and then we've introduced kind of the statistical language for those things. Under coverage is when we omit or exclude certain segments of the population, okay, and so those individuals would never have a chance to be included, which means our sample could never really be representative of everybody in the population. Okay, we see that sometimes we might select people, but they don't respond, okay, and missing those responses could greatly sway the results that we get, could greatly swing the estimate that we get. And then response bias, right? When people lie or they don't give accurate answers, that can drastically change our estimate, make it too high or make it too low. All right. So now let's go on to the second page, and we'll try to summarize these big ideas in our like formal section here. All right, so really this is just going to be a bunch of formal definitions of those three terms that we addressed or that we encountered on the first page. All right, so first let's define what undercoverage is. So undercoverage is when some members, some individuals of a population um, cannot or are just less likely to be included in a sample. Okay? And the example of that we had was, relying on landlines. Okay, so that's issue number one. Okay, the second issue we saw in those scenarios was non-response. Okay, so non-response is when an individual is chosen, is part of a sample, but they decide not to respond, or maybe they just can't be reached. Okay, so maybe it's a mail survey and they never mail it back. Maybe the survey got lost in the mail. Maybe it's a telephone survey and the person picks up the phone, realizes it's a survey, and then just hangs up. They don't want to participate. Okay. So yeah, that's non-response. All right, so let's write that definition down. So when the individual is chosen, but decides not to respond, or they just simply cannot be reached. So let me just make one small clarification here, is that non-response is different from voluntary response. Okay? So the volunteers, those people were never chosen. They were never selected by some random number generator. Okay, there was maybe like an open invitation, and then they voluntarily respond. Right. So just like on Amazon, right? When you look at the product reviews, right? That's an open invitation to anybody. Anybody can write a review for a product on Amazon. Okay. Non-response is really, really different. Non-response is when somebody was selected by the random number generator, or by their name getting pulled out of a hat, right? So they were selected through some random process, but then they decide not to participate. Okay. So let's see if we can kind of squeeze that extra tidbit of information in somewhere. Shrink that a little bit. Okay. So this is different from voluntary response. All right. The third kind of issue we saw that can go wrong with a sample survey is the response bias. So this is a pattern of inaccurate results. Okay? It could be because people are lying. It could be because they don't want to offend somebody. It could also be a pattern of inaccurate results because the question was worded poorly, right? And people misinterpret the question. So some examples, as I mentioned, of how we can get this pattern of inaccurate responses. It might be people lying, okay, like we saw on question 2 on the first page. It might be the influence of the interviewer, right, like the Boy Scout. Okay. And it could be because the question is worded poorly. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and end this video. You guys have another activity to do next. So this activity kind of wraps up the sampling portion of this unit, and then we're going to turn our attention to experimental design. Now, if you've taken AP Psychology, you might already know a little bit about experimental design. And so the rest of this unit might be a bit of review for you. Others, it's going to be something new, hopefully something exciting.